seemed to consume the world. Somewhere on that endless stretch of asphalt, a trucker drove alone, his headlights slicing through the gray void. It was supposed to be an ordinary night, just him, the open road, and the hum of his engine. But nothing about this night would be ordinary. Out of the haze it appeared, first a shadow, faint and flickering, like a ghost on the edge of reality. The trucker blinked, gripping the wheel tighter. Was it real, or was the fog playing tricks again? Then it moved, a figure, standing dead still in the center of the road, its arm raised in a silent plea. The trucker's heart pounded as he pressed the brakes, the screeching tires breaking the night's eerie stillness. Who would be out here, in the middle of nowhere at this hour? And why? Questions clawed at his mind as he brought the truck to a slow stop. His pulse thundered in his ears. Something didn't feel right. He knew the stories, drivers disappearing, unexplained accidents, and things that couldn't be explained. Yet against his better judgment, he rolled down the window. "You need help." His voice trembled more than he wanted it to. The figure didn't answer right away. Instead, it stepped closer, slow and deliberate, emerging from the fog like it had been waiting for this moment all along. The trucker had no way of knowing that what he was about to invite into his cab wasn't just a hitchhiker. It was something far worse. And once it climbed aboard, his nightmare would truly begin. Meet James Carter, a man of routine and resilience. A seasoned trucker in his mid-40s, James had spent the better part of 2 decades hauling cargo across the country. He was the type of man who found solace in the solitude of the open road. No distractions, no noise, just the hum of the engine and the endless highway stretching before him. To James, every mile meant progress, every delivery a promise kept. But this night was different. James had been called in last minute to transport a shipment of industrial equipment to a remote construction site. The route was long and mostly desolate, winding through a part of the country where cell service was non-existent, and the nearest town could be hours away. It didn't bother him though. Nights like these were his bread and butter. As the fog thickened around him, James adjusted his grip on the steering wheel, his fingers tapping out a slow rhythm. The radio crackled faintly, but the signal was weak. The world outside the cab was a swirling gray void, the kind of fog that seemed to wrap around you, muffling even the sound of your own breathing. James took a swig of coffee from his thermos, shaking off the drowsiness that threatened to creep in. He'd done this 100 times before. This was just another night. And then he saw it. At first it was barely noticeable, a smudge of darkness in the distance, standing against the endless expanse of fog. James squinted, leaning forward to peer through the windshield. The figure came into focus slowly, emerging like a mirage. It was a man, standing perfectly still on the side of the road. He wasn't waving, wasn't calling out for help. He just stood there, his arm half raised, as if he couldn't decide whether to signal for assistance or not. James's gut twisted. He knew better than to stop. There were too many stories. Traps set by criminals, people pretending to be stranded only to ambush unsuspecting drivers. But as he got closer, he could see the man's face, or at least the faint outline of it. He was young, maybe in his early 20s, wearing a tattered old jacket that hung loosely over his shoulders. He carried a small, worn duffel bag that looked almost too empty to be useful. There was no car in sight, no signs of an accident. Nothing to explain why he was out here, alone, in the middle of nowhere. James's foot hovered over the brake pedal. The truck's headlights illuminated the man fully now, casting long, eerie shadows into the fog behind him. For a moment, James thought about driving on, pretending he hadn't seen anything. But something stopped him. Maybe it was pity, or maybe it was guilt. Leaving someone out here in this weather didn't sit right with him. He sighed heavily, muttering under his breath, "All right, kid, let's hope you're not trouble." The truck came to a halt with a low groan, and James reached over to unlock the passenger door. The man didn't move at first, standing motionless, as if he hadn't expected James to stop. Then slowly, he walked toward the truck, his movements almost too deliberate, too calm for someone stranded on a deserted road. The door creaked open, and the hitchhiker climbed in without a word. He sat stiffly in the passenger seat, his hands resting on the small bag in his lap. James glanced at him, trying to break the silence. "Rough night to be out here." "Where you headed?" he asked, his voice steady despite the growing unease in his chest. The hitchhiker didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost inaudible. "Anywhere, I guess," he said, staring out the window. James frowned. That wasn't the answer he'd been expecting. "Anywhere, huh? Well, I can take you as far as Route 18. After that, you're on your own." The hitchhiker nodded but didn't look at him. As the truck rumbled back onto the highway, James couldn't help but steal glances at his passenger. There was something off about him. He sat unnaturally still, his eyes fixed on the fog outside, as if he were watching something James couldn't see. "You got a name?" James tried again, hoping to ease the tension. The man turned to him briefly, his face unreadable. "It doesn't matter," he said flatly, before returning his gaze to the window. The silence that followed was suffocating. James tried to focus on the road, but his nerves were on edge. The radio sputtered with static, filling the cab with an unsettling white noise. James reached to adjust the dial, but no matter where he turned it, the static wouldn't clear. The hitchhiker didn't seem to notice, or maybe he didn't care. Then came the first hint that something was truly wrong. James noticed the bag on the hitchhiker's lap move slightly, as if something inside had shifted. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but enough to make James's skin crawl. "What's in the bag?" he asked, trying to sound casual. The hitchhiker didn't look at him this time. "Just some things I need," he replied, his voice devoid of emotion. James nodded slowly, deciding not to press further. But the unease in his gut was growing stronger by the second. As the fog thickened outside, James felt the air in the cab grow colder, almost unnaturally so. He glanced at the dashboard. The heater was on full blast, yet he could see his breath fogging up in front of him. "You feel that?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. The hitchhiker didn't respond. He simply turned his head, his dark eyes locking onto James's. And for the first time that night, James felt truly afraid. The truck's engine hummed steadily as James kept his eyes on the road. The fog seemed heavier now, almost alive, pressing against the windshield like a living thing. Inside the cab, the silence had become oppressive. James stole a glance at the hitchhiker, who sat motionless, his face still turned toward the window. That same bag rested on his lap, its worn fabric barely holding together. But something about it caught James's attention again. Out of the corner of his eye, he thought he saw it shift. At first, James dismissed it. Maybe the motion of the truck had jostled it. But then it happened again. A small, deliberate movement, like something inside was rearranging itself. He cleared his throat, his voice breaking the uneasy silence. "What's in the bag?" he asked, keeping his tone light. The hitchhiker didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but cold. "Just some personal things," he replied. His eyes didn't move from the fog outside. James nodded slowly, pretending to focus on the road, but his knuckles tightened on the wheel. Moments later, the radio crackled to life. At first, it was just static, faint and unremarkable. But as the hitchhiker shifted slightly in his seat, the static grew louder, almost rhythmic, as if it were responding to his movements. James frowned, reaching for the dial. He turned it off, but the static continued. It was faint now, blending with the hum of the engine, but it was there, persistent, invasive. James glanced at the hitchhiker, who seemed entirely unbothered. Then the headlights flickered. It was just a brief moment, a blink, but enough to make James sit up straighter. "Damn truck," he muttered, tapping the dashboard as if that would fix it. The flicker didn't return, but a new unease settled in his chest. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he thought he saw something, a shadow moving in the fog just beyond the reach of the beams. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but it was there. He looked again, but the shadow was gone, swallowed by the gray void. "Did you see that?" James asked, his voice edged with tension. The hitchhiker didn't turn. "See what?" he replied, his tone indifferent, almost amused. James's heart thudded harder against his ribs. He shook his head and focused back on the road. It was just the fog, he told himself, just his imagination. The static had stopped, but the silence that replaced it was worse. James turned the heater dial up, trying to shake the chill that had crept into the cab. His breath hung visibly in the air now, despite the heat blasting from the vents. The hitchhiker finally moved, leaning forward slightly and resting his elbow on the window ledge. He began to hum, a low, off-key tune that sent a shiver down James's spine. It wasn't a melody James recognized, and it sounded wrong. Like the notes were out of place, mismatched somehow. "That's an interesting tune," James said, trying to break the tension. The hitchhiker didn't respond, his humming growing softer but more deliberate. James tightened his grip on the wheel, his unease building. The fog outside felt denser now, like a curtain closing in around them. Then James heard something else, a faint whisper just behind his ear. He turned sharply, his eyes darting around the cab, but there was nothing there. "You say something?" he asked, his voice sharper than he intended. The hitchhiker shook his head slowly. "No," he said, his tone flat. James's pulse quickened. The truck jolted suddenly, as if something had struck it from above. James slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching against the asphalt. Both men sat frozen for a moment, the only sound, the soft hiss of the air brakes. "What the hell was that?" James muttered, his eyes darting to the roof of the cab. The hitchhiker didn't react, his expression eerily calm. "Probably just a branch," he said, his voice devoid of concern. James wasn't convinced. He stepped out of the truck, his boots crunching against the gravel shoulder as he circled the vehicle. The roof was empty, no branches, no debris, nothing that could explain the sound. He climbed back into the cab, his unease now a tangible weight in his chest. James's nerves were frayed as he guided the truck back onto the road. The hitchhiker had gone quiet again, his eyes fixed on the fog outside. James caught a glimpse of him in the side mirror, but something made him look twice. The hitchhiker's reflection didn't match his movements. In the mirror, he was sitting unnaturally still, his hands clasped tightly together, while in reality, his hands rested casually on his lap. James blinked, thinking it was a trick of the light. But when he looked again, the reflection had shifted. It was watching him, a faint smirk playing on its lips. James's stomach dropped. He snapped his gaze back to the hitchhiker, who was now staring at him with those same dark, unblinking eyes. "We're not alone," the hitchhiker said suddenly, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. James's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice shaking. The hitchhiker didn't answer. Instead, he gestured toward the side mirror. Reluctantly, James glanced at it again. This time, he saw it, a shadowy figure running across the road behind them, its movements jerky and unnatural. He turned his head sharply, but the figure was gone. "Did you see that?" James asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The hitchhiker smiled faintly, his expression unreadable. "I told you," he said softly. "We're not alone." James's hands trembled on the wheel as he tried to make sense of what he'd seen. The road stretched on, endless and unforgiving, and the fog seemed to tighten its grip around them. James knew deep in his gut that this night was far from over. James gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles turning white as the truck pressed onward through the fog. The air in the cab felt heavier now, colder. His breath formed faint clouds as it escaped his lips, and no matter how high he turned up the heater, the cold persisted. Then, without warning, the truck lurched violently, the engine sputtering before the entire vehicle ground to a halt. James cursed under his breath, flipping switches and pressing pedals, trying to coax the massive machine back to life. But nothing happened. The engine was dead, and the headlights dimmed before flickering out completely, plunging them into a suffocating darkness. "What the hell now?" James muttered, his voice cracking as he reached for a flashlight. The silence outside was deafening, broken only by the occasional groan of metal settling and the faint rustle of leaves shifting in the fog. He glanced at the hitchhiker, who sat eerily calm, a faint smile curling on his lips. And then the laughter began. At first it was quiet, almost polite, a chuckle that barely broke the silence. But it grew louder, deeper, reverberating through the cab like a low growl. James's skin prickled as he turned toward the hitchhiker, his heart hammering against his ribs. The sound didn't match the man in front of him. It was guttural, distorted, and impossibly inhuman. "What's so damn funny?" James demanded, his voice trembling. The hitchhiker turned to him slowly, his eyes catching the faint glow of the flashlight. They weren't normal anymore. They were dark, too dark, like twin voids that seemed to pull the light inward and extinguish it. "You wouldn't understand," the hitchhiker said, his voice layered with an unsettling echo. James's hand shook as he tried to restart the engine. The key turned, but the truck refused to respond. The fog outside seemed alive now, pressing against the windows, curling into shapes that dissolved before they could fully form. James could feel his pulse in his throat, his mind racing with thoughts he didn't want to entertain. What was this? Who was this? And more importantly, how was he going to get out of here? The flashlight beam wavered as James scanned the cab, desperate for anything that could help him make sense of what was happening. His eyes fell on the hitchhiker's bag, which sat quietly on the man's lap, the fabric oddly pristine despite its weathered appearance. The hitchhiker watched him, that faint smile never leaving his lips. "What's in the bag?" James asked again, his voice sharp and strained. This time the hitchhiker didn't hesitate. He placed the bag on the seat between them and unzipped it, revealing a neatly folded stack of papers. James leaned closer, his curiosity overriding his fear for a moment. He pulled out one of the sheets and felt the blood drain from his face. It was a newspaper clipping, yellowed with age. The headline read, "Local trucker found dead on Highway 67, murder remains unsolved." James scanned the article, his hands trembling. The details were sparse, but the description of the victim hit too close to home. This can't be real," James whispered, his voice barely audible. The hitchhiker chuckled again, low and mocking. "Oh, it's very real," he said. James looked up, his heart pounding. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice breaking. The hitchhiker tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "I was never on the side of the road," he said softly, his words hanging in the air like a noose. James's mind reeled as memories from earlier in the night came rushing back, distorted and disjointed. The hitchhiker's bag, he realized now, hadn't been visible in the mirror. His voice had distorted the radio, and those shadows in the fog, had they been following the truck all along? James felt the walls of his reality closing in as he stared at the man, or whatever he was, sitting beside him. "You need to tell me what the hell is going on," James growled, his voice trembling with fear and frustration. The hitchhiker didn't respond right away. Instead, he leaned back in his seat, his dark eyes fixed on James with an intensity that made his skin crawl. "You already know," the hitchhiker said finally, his voice cold and measured. James shook his head, his breathing ragged. "No, I don't. Just tell me who or what you are." The hitchhiker's smile widened, but it was devoid of warmth. "I'm here to make sure you remember," he said cryptically. James's thoughts spiraled as he tried to piece together what the hitchhiker meant. Remember what? He hadn't done anything wrong, had he? He thought about the countless miles he'd driven, the lonely nights on the road. Had he missed something? Was there a moment, a decision, that had led him here? The hitchhiker leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "This road remembers everything," he said. "Every lie, every secret, every sin. It doesn't let go." James felt his stomach churn. The fog outside thickened, pressing against the windows like a living thing. The truck felt smaller now, the air colder, heavier. "What do you mean?" James whispered, his voice barely audible. The hitchhiker sat back, his face unreadable. "You'll see soon enough," he said. And with that, the lights in the cab flickered back on, casting an eerie glow over the hitchhiker's face. James stared at him, his fear turning to a cold, sinking dread. Whatever was happening, it was far from over. James's hands trembled on the steering wheel as the realization hit him. This wasn't normal. None of this was. Whatever the hitchhiker was, it wasn't human. His breath came in short gasps, and the oppressive silence inside the cab felt like it was crushing him. Without thinking, he flung the door open, his boots hitting the asphalt as he bolted into the fog. He didn't have a plan, just an instinctual need to get away, to put as much distance as possible between himself and the truck. The cold air wrapped around him like a vice as he stumbled forward, his flashlight beam cutting weakly through the dense mist. His heartbeat thundered in his ears, his breath coming out in frantic clouds. The truck's headlights dimmed behind him, swallowed entirely by the fog within seconds. He was alone now, or so he thought. Then it started. The voice. "Running won't help, James." The words echoed all around him, carried on the fog like whispers on the wind. James froze, his flashlight trembling in his grip. "Where are you?" he shouted, spinning in circles, but the voice didn't stop. "You can't escape what you are," it said, mocking and calm. "Do you even remember, James? Do you remember what you did?" James's chest tightened as panic clawed at him. The voice sounded closer now, shifting from a whisper to a low growl. He stumbled forward, desperate to outrun whatever was chasing him, but the fog seemed alive, pressing in on all sides, twisting the landscape into something unfamiliar. He tripped over a rock and fell hard, the flashlight clattering out of his hands. As he scrambled to his feet, he realized the voice was inside his head now, speaking directly to him, revealing things no one should know. "That night on this road, James," the voice said, almost gentle now. "What really happened? Think, James, you've buried it so deep, haven't you?" James pressed his hands over his ears, shouting, "Stop it! Shut up!" But the voice only grew louder, more insistent. He ran blindly into the fog, his fear driving him forward, even as the ground beneath him seemed to shift and sway. James's legs burned as he stumbled through the endless fog. The road was gone now, replaced by an uneven dirt path that seemed to stretch forever. The voice had gone silent, leaving only the sound of his labored breathing and the distant rustle of leaves. He slowed to a walk, his body trembling with exhaustion. Then he saw it, a faint shape ahead, barely visible in the thick mist. As he approached, it became clearer. A cross, simple and weathered, planted firmly in the ground. Around it were flowers, long wilted, and a small photo encased in plastic. James's breath hitched as he leaned closer, the flashlight revealing the image. It was him. His heart stopped as he stared at the photo, a younger version of himself, smiling proudly, wearing the same jacket he had on now. Beneath it was an inscription carved into a wooden plaque. "In loving memory of James Carter, lost on Highway 67. James stumbled back, his flashlight slipping from his grasp. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. This isn't real. It can't be." But the evidence was right in front of him, undeniable and horrifying. He sank to his knees, his mind racing. Memories began flooding back, fragmented and hazy. A sharp turn, blinding headlights, the sound of screeching tires, and then nothing. "You've been here ever since," came a familiar voice. James turned sharply, and there he was, the hitchhiker, standing just a few feet away, his dark eyes gleaming with a cruel satisfaction. "What is this?" James demanded, his voice cracking. "What are you?" The hitchhiker tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "I'm the one who makes sure you remember," he said softly. "You've been driving this road for years, James, lost in the fog, pretending it never happened. But you can't run from the truth forever." James shook his head violently, tears streaming down his face. "No, I'm alive. I was just driving tonight. This is a mistake." The hitchhiker stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "Think about it, James," he said. "Have you seen another soul on this road? Heard another engine? Felt the warmth of the sun? This isn't tonight. This is every night." James's body shook with sobs as the realization sank in. He wasn't alive. He never had been. Not since that night. He was trapped here, doomed to relive the endless journey through the fog, haunted by the truth he had tried so hard to forget. James stood frozen, his mind unraveling as the hitchhiker circled him slowly. The fog seemed thicker now, almost suffocating, as if it were closing in around them. "Why are you doing this to me?" James whispered, his voice barely audible. The hitchhiker stopped in front of him, leaning in close. "Because you are me," he said, his voice a low growl. James's eyes widened in horror as the hitchhiker's face began to change, shifting and contorting until it became his own. He stumbled back, clutching his head as the truth crashed over him like a tidal wave. The hitchhiker wasn't someone he had picked up on the road. He was a reflection, a manifestation of his guilt, his denial, his punishment. James turned and ran, but the fog was unrelenting, swallowing him whole. He found himself back at the truck, the headlights flickering weakly in the distance. As he approached, he caught sight of his reflection in the side mirror. But it wasn't him. It was the hitchhiker, smiling that same cold, cruel smile. "No!" James screamed, banging on the door, begging for it to open. The hitchhiker's face stared back at him, unblinking. The fog thickened, wrapping around the truck like a shroud. The screen faded to black as James's screams echoed into the void, growing fainter and fainter until there was nothing left but silence. The screen fades in from black, revealing the truck, its engine idling softly, headlights flickering weakly in the thick, unyielding fog. The cab is empty. The door hangs slightly ajar, swinging gently as if someone had just stepped out. The faint hum of the engine fills the void, accompanied by the occasional crackle of static from the broken radio. The camera pans out, pulling back to show the desolate stretch of highway shrouded in an oppressive mist. There's no sound of life, no passing cars, no rustling trees, only the eerie silence that seems to swallow everything. Then, far in the distance, headlights pierce through the fog. The faint roar of an engine grows louder as another truck approaches, its shape barely visible in the swirling mist. It slows as it nears the abandoned vehicle, the driver's curiosity piqued by the lone truck sitting idle on the shoulder of the road. The new trucker peers out of his window, squinting into the fog. His headlights catch a figure standing just ahead, a man on the side of the road, his hand raised in a silent plea for help. The trucker hesitates, his fingers drumming nervously on the wheel. Something about the figure seems off, but the trucker shakes off the feeling, reasoning that it's just the fog playing tricks on his eyes. He pulls over, the truck hissing softly as it comes to a stop. The camera lingers on the hitchhiker as he steps toward the truck, his movements deliberate, his face obscured by shadow. The trucker leans out of his window, calling out, "Need a ride?" The figure doesn't respond immediately. Then, with a slow, unsettling smile, he nods and climbs into the cab. The truck's engine roars back to life, and it disappears into the fog, leaving the first truck behind, its headlights finally flickering out. The screen holds on the abandoned truck for a moment before the fog swallows it completely. Was the trucker a victim of the fog or a prisoner of his own mind? What really happened on that desolate highway? The answers may never be known, but one thing is certain: some roads are best left untraveled. A faint sound echoes, a distant laugh, distorted and unnatural, before the voice returns, steady and inviting. If this story gave you chills, let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think James ever found peace, or will he haunt the highway forever? We'd love to hear your theories. The tone shifts slightly, becoming warmer yet still mysterious. And if you want more stories like this, tales of the strange, the unexplained, and the downright terrifying, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the bell icon to stay updated.